Fintech Chatter, brought to you by Tier 1 People, leaders in fintech executive search. Welcome to episode 113 of Fintech Chatter, the show where I chat to fintech leaders and get their insights on hiring, growing the business, raising capital, and all of the other stuff that goes into being an entrepreneur and innovator. I'm your host, Dexter Cousins, and I've got a very special interview for you today. Josh Foreman is the founder of Indebted, a fintech changing the world of consumer debt recovery for good. I recently caught up with Josh to record Indebted's People's Choice Award podcast, but we decided to record an extended version for our loyal Fintech Chatter fans. Indebted were recently recognised as Australia's #1 place to work by the Australian Financial Review. So I have an in-depth chat with Josh about his approach to hiring, building a remote-first, high-performance culture where people can do their best work. And I've got a little favour to ask. If you do like the show, please show your support with a 5-star review. It really helps me in bringing in great guests like Josh and keep the show sponsor-free. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dex. Good to be here.
Mate, it's awesome to have you with us.
Been a while.
First of all, we're here to talk about the People's Choice Award finalists in Fintech of the Year. Congrats to you all for making it this far. How are you and the team at Indebted feeling?
Yeah, good. It's been, I feel like it's been a massive just few years, right? We rolled in from pandemic to post-pandemic into the world that we're in now, but been good, bit busy, lots of growth, lots of executing. I think everyone's definitely, everyone always feels ready for a break. I certainly feel ready for a break, even though we're in May already. But things are going really well.
Awesome. Now, we're here to talk about the Finnies, and we're going to do a two-parter today, actually, a bit of a special one. First part's going to be on the Finnies, and then we're going to talk about something really big that happened just a couple of weeks ago where you guys were recognized as the best place to work in Australia. Like, what an incredible achievement.
Yeah, so it was, look, we thought we placed well. We thought we placed pretty well within tech, but to take out the overall award was, a really, really great shock. But for everyone, it was a pretty amazing moment.
Awesome. Well, Josh, I guess congratulations, again, on making it to the People's Choice Finals. This is the award that the fintech community gets to decide. And it's become, I think, a real favorite in the category, mainly because of the kudos of being, selected by your peers. But look, I thought before we kind of went into some of the specifics on why the fintech community should vote for Indebted, do you want to tell us a little bit about the big problem that you guys solve?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the pitch line is Indebted is changing the world of consumer debt recovery for good. But when you unpack that, it's helpful to have a look at the way that the particularly the collections world worked, prior to Indebted, which is fundamentally a business model that is not really focused on consumer outcome. It's a business model that's focused on how many dollars, what's the maximum amount of dollars we can collect from people who are overdue. And there's really, not only is there no focus on the consumer outcome, or very little, there's really not an appreciation or a passion around, technology and data. And those were sort of the three pillars that we built the business on. How do we transform this, sort of archaic call center model into a digital first engagement environment? How do we use this take this one size fits all approach and turn that into a much more data-driven scientific approach that looks at each individual consumer and what's the best way to engage with them? And then how do we tie all that together and actually make it a good outcome and an enjoyable experience for consumers? And so, that was the ethos of where the business started, and we've grown sort of continually on the back of that today. And, we're able to provide a far better solution for our clients and a far better solution for consumers who are in debt. And we want to tie all that together, into our longer term vision around actually making, the world a better place for those consumers and helping them, move forward on a path towards, better financial fitness.
Awesome. So are you guys a B2B play or a B2C, or how does the model work?
We like to think of ourselves as a B2B2C, in the sense that, so our clients think of, large financial services organizations, utility, telecommunications, fintech, buy now, pay later, anything in that sort of category. They're our clients. Those are the parties that engage us, but they're engaging us to communicate with their customers, which we also refer to as our customers. So almost like a marketplace model, you've got our clients on the left, customers on the right, and Indebted is essentially the ecosystem and platform in which we engage with those consumers regarding their.
Cool. I got kind of previous experience, not necessarily working with in a debt collection agency, but they have been clients in the past. And look, I think the biggest challenge for those businesses was always trying to hire people for the call center, and the churn rate is absolutely, I mean, it's unbelievably high. What's kind of been the approach then of the Indebted model? Like, how does it work? You guys got a call center. How does the actual, the technology work?
So high level numbers, which help to sort of set the scene, about 99% of all the communications we have with consumers is digital. So not a phone call, not a letter, think email, SMS, WhatsApp, live chat, channels like that. And about 92% of all the consumers that engage with us do so in a self-service format. So they use our product, our app, our website to basically rectify their accounts and deal with their situation as opposed to speaking to us. However, 8% of now a pretty large growing number do want to communicate with us and have a conversation regarding that account. And that's where sort of our, quote unquote call center comes into play. We run a customer service team, and it's a predominantly digital customer service environment, though we still have voice in there as well. And that sort of operates, again, primarily on an inbound basis, more so than an outbound basis, like a traditional collections business. But it's much more of a customer service operation than outbound collections call center.
Got you. So how many people is Indebted now?
I think last update I saw from the team on Slack, 269 people globally.
So when you were first on the podcast, which I think was, a year and a half ago, maybe?
Yeah, it seems.
You were 80 people.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Does
that sound about right?
About right.
So how on earth have you managed to triple the size of your business in a period which has been undoubtedly, my 23 years of recruitment, the toughest or tightest talent market, in that period? How have you managed to triple the size of your business?
Yeah, so I think firstly, a shout out to our team themselves, right? So this is a team effort, and particularly our broader people team that put a ton of work into making this possible. Because as you mentioned, not only finding and attracting that talent, but onboarding and growing and nurturing that talent is also equally difficult, particularly given the scale of growth that you mentioned. I think there's a few things for us. One, we think our vision is really spot on. Like a lot of people are interested in working in technology companies. They're exciting, they're innovative, they're at the forefront of what's happening. But we have a real, social mission that I think underlines what we're trying to do. We're a business, and we of course need to make revenue and make profits, but we've found a way to be able to do that that provides a far better outcome for consumers. And I think that when we talk about people who want to join the business, they're very much attracted to that idea of, yes, I can write some great code, or yes, I can be a part of a great growth team or a client success team, but I can do that, working with clients and consumers to provide a far better experience than they would otherwise get. So I think that sort of is probably the bedrock of what we're looking at. And then we've put a huge amount of investment into, our people sort of initiatives, we call out employee value proposition, and making it really compelling for people to want to work at Indebted and be part of that vision.
Awesome. Now, are you guys just here in Oz, or are you international now? So
yeah, we're fully international, and we're for the most part, although we do have some offices around the world, we consider ourselves a remote first, globally distributed team. We were already, I would say, sort of 50% there pre-COVID, and then COVID accelerated that across other parts of the business that were otherwise sort of centered in certain regions. So I think last numbers I saw were 260, 270 people across 11 countries around the world. And we're operating out of 5 markets in terms of our product offering to our clients in 5 different markets.
Awesome. And in terms of clients, what kind of growth have you seen in this last 12 months?
Yeah, a lot. So like from a top line revenue perspective, we'll finish this fiscal year off, so 30 June, a little bit north of 100%, about 120% most likely from last year, which was up sort of roughly the same again from the year before. So the top line growth and number of clients and logos is growing. The big thing for us, and I think where the business has really taken a different step, is our international growth strategy is being driven by our clients. So clients that we, originally brought on board in Australia or New Zealand are the ones pulling us into markets like Canada, like the United States, the UK. And now there's equal amount of demand on, places like Germany, Italy, Spain, and France, and others across Europe as well.
Now, in terms of, I guess, the product that you have, what's the problem? There's a lot of competition to fix the problem. The way that you're fixing it, I'm not aware of much competition at all. But look, if there is, how have you differentiated yourself from them?
Yeah, so we've definitely got a couple of venture-backed we call them fintech competitors in the space. Not many, like maybe 2 or 3 that are really of significant scale. And for the most part, we I would say, originally operated in a fairly disparate way because the collections industry in particular is a very regionally focused product. So even when you look at a big business like a large credit card issuer across multiple markets, they'll engage different collection agencies in each market and run different sub-teams because it's just never been something you could centralize globally. And so it wasn't until we really started to make really significant headway in international markets, particularly North America, that we realized that, outside of the fact that we genuinely believe our product is better, the outcomes from the consumer side are clear. We're the most customer-centric collections business in the world. And, the consumers say that for themselves. But also the fact that we're able to provide this offering across multiple jurisdictions is something that is today very, very intriguing for particularly financial technology businesses that operate in multiple markets. And it's becoming more and more of interest for large, global credit card issuers and financial services organizations who see an opportunity to consolidate, their collections operations globally, and then also work with a partner at the forefront on the tech side and the consumer outcome piece as well.
So when you look back over this kind of last 12 months, Josh, what are some of the things that you're kind of proud about and what Indebted has achieved?
Yeah, so I think you mentioned earlier on around, it was a really tough one. It still remains a very tough talent market, and obviously things are changing now and there's different factors at play. I think like the same way we approached our actual business and what we're trying to do with our product and the industry we operate in, we sort of sat back as a team and said, what's a way to approach this that's different and that's unique? And we really wanted to make sure that we, weren't really competing in the same way that everyone else was for talent, because we saw that as sort of a zero-sum game, and we needed to find a way to differentiate ourselves. And that resulted in that, huge investment on our EVP and making sure that, what we were providing to candidates was incredibly attractive, but then actually backing it up with a culture that we've built. And I think the fact that we've been able to maintain that and, the rankings we get in our culture and, pulse surveys, what people say about Indebted, and obviously, the award that we won a couple of weeks back as a reflection of that is definitely the thing I'm most proud of. We have an incredible team, and you need an incredible team when you build a business in an environment like the one we've been through and the one we're going into now. So I think for me, it all comes down to the team.
So we're now at part 2, people, and we're going to have a chat with Josh around this amazing accolade and achievement of becoming the best place, or voted the best place in Australia to work. Not by any publication, but by the AFR. Some real incredible businesses in there that you guys have beaten as well, Josh. Not only are we going to talk about your approach, but a lot of the things that you've talked about there, the great resignation, this shift that we're starting to see, the impact that it's going to have on the talent market. And I guess, to go in depth as well, and some of the things that you've done and a little bit more in detail, some of the initiatives that you've put in place to help you triple the size of the business in terms of workforce, but also to do it in a way in which you've been recognized for being best place to work. So you kind of touched on that earlier in the interview, that you kind of sat, the moment for it was during COVID, where you sat down with the rest of the team and figured, hey, well, if we're going to be different, we've got to be different, right? So what was the kind of first thing that you recognized when you were going through that process as to what wasn't working and what perhaps had to change?
Yeah, so I think, all the normal sort of options were on the table. And I think as we looked at them in terms of, further investment in talent acquisition and, working with external providers and doing all those things, which we still continue to do today. And it's still a fundamental part of how we run our people operations. But it was hard to identify how one of those things in particular was going to be a standout differentiator and something where we could really, shake the can essentially and say, like, look, this is something that's very different. It's going to grab a lot of attention, and it's something that we can build on as a differentiator. And one of the stats that I looked at that really stood clear to me was our engineering pipeline. So for talent, and looking at how many things we want to build, how much stuff we want to get out, and the fact that we forever, like I'm sure many startups feel this, never have a full engineering team. You always have more roles available than you have talent coming in, and it seems like a never-ending process of just hiring and hiring and hiring. And I looked at that and thought, if we had all the roles filled, and we'll talk about, and I want to talk about productivity in a moment, but even if there was a productivity decrease as a result of any of these initiatives, the ultimate outcome on a reduced amount of productivity on a larger amount of team base was going to be still more output. And so that was really what sort of stood out to me, is that filling those empty roles and getting people into the business and starting to execute on our product roadmap further, irrespective of what any maybe perceived downsides could be, will still ultimately push the business forward faster than we were without those roles filled.
Now, what I really like about what you've talked about there is we've got a kind of methodology around hiring, which is very much emulated by how our clients go about product development and fixing problems in their business. And that's to use first principles thinking and also design thinking around actually fixing the problems around hiring. What we found is that 50% of the time when a client comes to us, the actual problem that they have in the business can be solved without actually hiring someone. So it's kind of great to hear that you've taken that approach to go, actually, what's the real problem that we've got here? Because I think the natural inclination is that when there's a problem, automatically assume that hiring somebody fixes that problem, and it actually creates a lot more problems in the business, particularly if you get it wrong, right?
100%.
So what was how did that then kind of filter through to, okay, we need to fill these positions? I guess the next part is, well, what does that position look like? Because oftentimes we found that the problem, it might be fixed in 3 months, and then you've hired someone and say, well, what do we do now?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think to your point, once we landed on, okay, we need to fill these roles, and that is something that's essential. We also had a quick sort of look back into the actual existing organization to just get a sense of really, where everyone was at. And there's two things that really stood out to me. One was and I certainly, I'm speaking for myself here, but I feel like a lot of people agree, is that it's been a pretty difficult last few years, right? Where the world, from every perspective you can think about it, has been throwing a curveball almost consistently. We've been in lockdowns, we have a pandemic, and we come out of a pandemic, we have another lockdown, now we've got wars, now we've got a macro environment change. It seems to be one thing after another. And when you've got to deal with all of that external context, whilst at the same time, the craziness of building a startup and trying to scale that, it's really hard on people. And it's hard on every person in the organization. And as I looked across the business, you could see that. You could see people who are burning out, people who are tired, people who are exhausted, and not always just for reasons that are work related. Obviously, that's a contributing factor, but for the external things as well. Haven't been able to see family, haven't been able to travel, have a proper holiday, all of those sort of things. So I took that internal part and overlaid that on the external piece around their talent attraction, and also did a bit of assessment more broadly on like what I thought people sort of really cared about in terms of, not just with inside work, but outside of work. And it stood pretty clear to me that this whole work, particularly work from home environment that we're in at the time, we basically seemed to live two lives: the lives in front of our computer, which was most of the day, and the couple of hours we spent on the other side of the computer, which didn't really give people time to fill those other things in their life, whether that's family, whether it's external things, philanthropic work, whatever that may be. And so those three things ultimately led to, that first core initiative for us, which was the 4-day work week. And then that was a big catalyst into a bunch of other things that we did.
Yeah. With the 4-day work week, how's that impacted productivity?
Yeah, so for us, it's been good. And I think I'd like to preface this with, because I think when people grab the headlines, they think like, okay, Josh is all for 4-day work week and the whole world should roll it out and it's the best thing for everybody. That's not that's definitely not my position. I do think the world is moving much more in that direction. Absolutely. However, I think it's about understanding those sort of core, like you mentioned, rationale for your business and what you're trying to solve. So for us, I entered it with that perspective of, let's assume simple math is a 20% decrease in productivity. If we've get an X% increase in talent into the business and retain that talent, then it'll be a net positive for the organization. In reality, we saw virtually no decrease in productivity. There were a couple of teams that are obviously consumer and client facing where we needed to staff up a little bit more to support. So you could argue that's just an increased cost as opposed to sort of the dip in the productivity piece. But across the board, we saw people work smarter instead of just working harder. And I think because of our goal setting processes and the OKRs and things that we'd set prior to that, we were able to sort of balance the two things, which is Indebted still wants to achieve the goals that we've all set and our teams want to achieve the goals that they've set. However, we want to really give this initiative a real shot and really want to see if we can make it work. And then fortunately for us, no deterioration really in productivity, but massive improvements in other areas of the business.
Okay, so the conversations that I have with chief execs and leaders typically around this subject, Josh, is that I think the vast majority of businesses are not seeing the outputs or the outcomes that they want, particularly with this kind of struggle of people not coming back to the office. Now, on the flip side to that, I think most employees don't want to come back to the office, and there's a real kind of interesting dynamic that's going on, which is an individual kind of believes that their productivity is improved because now they're not traveling into work. As you said, they can work smarter. They've got more free time. They're a bit more relaxed when they are doing work. Their output, they feel, is increased. Yet when I speak to leaders, they're saying that, hey, well, those individual productivity gains aren't actually contributing to an increase in productivity and outcomes across the business. What is it that you think could potentially be the issue there, or the problem, or the thing that's not quite kind of happening if you're getting these great outcomes and yet you're able to work fully remote?
Yeah, so I think, to your point, you mentioned sort of that, I guess, that discrepancy almost between output and outcome. And I think ultimately you need to be an outcomes-driven organization. And I think and there are exceptions, of course, I understand, particularly in very sort of process-orientated roles where it's very much about sort of the productivity output, et cetera. But I think fundamentally, as an organization looks about the outcomes that it's going to drive and tries to decouple them specifically from the output of the amount of time that's needed. For me to deliver on my outcomes for the business, like, of course, there are weeks where it's not about whether it's 4 days, it's whether it's 7 days.
Yeah, I was going to say 24/7.
Right? And so if that's what it takes to push the business forward and to help my team and to deliver on the things we have to do, I have to suck that up and I have to do that. But how do I also balance that when there are times where you're hitting your numbers and things are going well and everything's great? And it's like, why do I need to create more time for myself? Why can't you have that extra time? And so I think driving towards the outcome and trying to balance those things, and particularly remove the distractions and the things that sit on the peripheral, are definitely key to that.
The whole remote working thing, I think I've seen some really interesting, again, kind of compiling data on this and interviewing people. I think it would be not inaccurate to say that businesses that have started in the last 3 to 5 years it's been much easier for them to embrace fully remote than an established organization. I think there's a few reasons why. Is that one, kind of work practices haven't, you're at a point where you really don't have, kind of enterprise-wide, kind of infrastructure and all of those things from a technology perspective, so you can change pretty quickly. But also, I think the other thing is that a lot of businesses have hired people, and we've seen this in 2020, where there were star performers in a business who, as soon as we went to work from home, just crumbled and they couldn't deliver sitting from their bedroom. They needed to be in an environment that was around people. What have you looked for when you're now hiring to identify people who have the attributes and the behaviors and the skills that are required to be able to deliver outcomes when you're sat isolated in your bedroom and you can't just go to the water cooler and have a bit of conversation with someone or get that energy from, going into the office and kind of getting pumped up.
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's two ways I look at it. So one is in terms of the actual, like you said, when we're sort of bringing on new talent to the business, how do we sort of filter and sort of almost identify sort of almost an aptitude towards working not only remotely, but in many cases asynchronously as well, because we have a bunch of time zone elements to factor in. I think one of the key parts of it is, of course, making sure that that person can still be successful in their role, not only be it remotely, but also potentially in a completely different time zone. So, for example, we've set up engineering teams both in Europe and in the United States. Now, to do that, you need to also make sure that you still have engineering leadership in those areas that can grow and nurture those teams and help people and be there to support. You can't just hire a single individual contributor, say in Texas, and hope that they're just going to be able to pick up and make everything work with the team with a 2 or 3 hour overlap with Australia. However, if you can build a small team there with a leader who can give that guidance, I think that's a key part to it. The other thing is obviously when people read about Indebted, it's obviously one of the key things that's front and center. So I think we naturally attract a certain sort of aptitude of person who really wants to be involved in that way. And the other part is also just being upfront with candidates. Like when you onboard and you're going through that process, it's still something we're trying to make better and better over time, and it's never going to be perfect. But there is that investment in getting across the tools, working out how you remain connected, being involved in the extracurricular remote activities like the team bonding events and meeting the leadership team and things like that are important in order to be able to get a broader context across the business. And also then I think from a leadership team perspective, myself and others communicating much more frequently, and this is still something we need to do better at, is communicating more frequently across the broader team so everyone's aware of what we're doing and why we're doing it. The other part I think is important is recognizing that you do still need in-person time. Like you mentioned that some people really thrive in that sort of environment. We still catch up in both smaller teams and larger teams frequently in different parts of the world. And when I was able to get back on a plane and fly overseas and see some of the team, that was incredible. It's certainly something I missed, during the pandemic. But I think the notion of doing that 5 days a week in one centralized part of the world is just not something our organization would ever go back to.
I want to go into a little bit more detail about the recruitment process. And there's something that you said there, which I think is really important. You talked about being honest with people in the interview process. I don't think that there's ever intentionally, or very rarely is there kind of, an intentional misrepresentation or misleading, but I think oftentimes the language that's used creates a lot of kind of gray area. And, I think to give some examples, if you turn around to a candidate and say, hey, it's a really challenging environment here, I've never met anybody who will turn around and say, oh, I don't like a challenge. But it's the kind of level of the challenge, right? And that kind of context around, well, what actually is the challenge? Or the other one might be, hey, we're looking for people who want to make a difference. Well, of course, it's like everybody wants to make a difference, but what are you prepared to sacrifice in order to make that difference? How have you kind of gone about, and what kind of language do you use, and questions do you ask people to really be able to drill down, and kind of cut through the kind of fascia of, what somebody might think their environment's like, whether they're going to be sitting on beanbags, drinking kombucha, dreaming up how they're going to solve world hunger with a blockchain, or whether this is seriously hard work and you're going to be challenged in ways you've never been challenged before.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it certainly varies from team to team and from role to role, but there's certainly a few consistencies. I think there's obviously the assessment on the aptitude for the skills that we're looking for, right? So whether it's for an engineer or a product manager or a salesperson, there'll be particular things that you need to look for. But there's also, and this is something we do across all the teams, is that there is that sort of, I don't like to call it culture fit, but culture add assessment that we look at, which is how do we think this person will contribute and add to the culture that we're trying to build it Indebted, and look for ways to both to improve that, and also during that identify ways or areas where we think, and we need to sort of openly raise with people like that may be a challenge, for you to operate in this particular environment, like you said. And the big one I have found is, to your point earlier, people coming from working in a sort of predominantly sort of office-based environment to working in a remote first business. And even though there'll be the attractive parts of it, well, I get more time at home, I get more time with my family, less time commuting, all those things you mentioned, you've also got to recognize it's like, okay, well, what happens when it's, midday in the UK and I need something from Josh and he's fast asleep in Sydney? Like, that doesn't necessarily help. And so understanding how we, both communicate, how we use the tooling and all of those things is key. But I think it's about trying to give the candidate as clear of a picture of like, what does day-to-day life look like? What are the things that we're trying to solve? What are the team that you're currently working with, meeting them, understanding their challenges and the goals and the outcomes they're trying to move towards. And then also, I think, being realistic on ramp-up time, getting into the organization and actually being, the time from when you start to being actually like a true contributing team member. A lot of people like to think it's like, to your point earlier, hire the role, solve the problem. Yeah. You've also got like the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 month ramp up, depending on what sort of role you're talking about. And you need to be able to and be willing upfront to give people that time to adjust, not just to the new role and its expectations, but potentially to an organization that works and operates in a completely different way than the one they've operated before.
A friend of mine's asked me to write an article on the talent shortage, and I'm kind of in the middle of it. But there was something that I wanted to kind of get across, which is this distinction around skills versus talent. And I think we're absolutely in the midst of a skill shortage, right? But we always will be. If you're at the cutting edge of innovation, you're the leader, right? There isn't a nascent pool of talent there just waiting to be picked up. The distinction that I make between skills and talent is, I think, for me, if you're going to assess somebody on skills, what you're looking for is a worker. Talent, I think, needs to be assessed on skills, plus their behavior under pressure, plus the outcomes that they deliver. And for me, I think most recruitment processes, in fact, most hiring, is based on let's just identify somebody with the skills. And as you say, are they a culture fit? And so you get these questions that are just, they're bizarre, right? Like some of them that get asked. And as you say, right, there is actually not such a thing as a culture fit. A person will either add to your culture or they will detract from it, right? They'll either make it, better or they'll make it worse, right? There's no neutrality and there's none of this thing around fit. So I think it's kind of, they're really important distinctions, because when all you're doing is assessing skills, that is the assumption, right? Is that, okay, great, they've got the skills, day one, they can come in, they don't need any support, they'll hit the ground running. And I think that's the reality, is that kind of, talent needs to be nurtured. It needs to be developed. It needs to be given, as you say, that kind of platform to actually show itself.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think particularly in early stage startups, it's all about being a generalist and wearing multiple hats, right? And even as a business scales into much more of a scale up and you need some of those specific skills and specific roles, you've got to appreciate those that have been able to deal with diverse amount of situations and things that get thrown at them, and their ability to pivot and correct and adjust to those challenges as they're presented. And I think the last 2 to 3 years have been nothing but a perfect reflection of that, and where real great talent will shine through. But I couldn't agree more. And I think we've all experienced, and certainly you would have far more than I have, is that perfect candidate from a skills perspective on a resume that ultimately doesn't end up being successful within an organization for everything else that you didn't actually assess them on during the onboarding process and recruitment process. And I think that's why those other elements to the talent piece that you spoke about is so much more important.
Yeah, look, and they're painful lessons, right? I mean, I kind of take a lot of pride in getting the right fit for my clients. And, that's been based on 2 decades of, experiences of seeing where it's gone wrong and seeing the actual impact that has on a business. So I think it's mission critical that anybody who's hiring goes through and takes the time that you've taken, right, and treats this as a this isn't just a 30-day process of, hey, let's put a job spec together, let's advertise, let's do some interviews, great, hired. This is actually a process we go through, Josh, is let's talk about the next 2 years, right? Now we've figured out what the problem is. What's the outcome you're looking for, right? How do you want to see that person deliver it in 2 years? The 18 months, what do you want to see? 12 months, what do you want to see? 6 months, what do you want to see? 3 months, what's the expectation? First 30 days, what does that look like? And you get that clarity. And what we've found is that oftentimes, we call it the search for the blue-eyed unicorn. You require 3 different people, completely different skill sets, to get you to each stage of that, or each of those phases. And I think this is one of the issues why, again, we kind of confuse a talent shortage. It's not, with 7.6 billion people on the planet that are the most advanced in the history of humanity that we can connect with instantly, who can work from anywhere. And 87% of us have got a smartphone with internet connection. I cannot accept, that there's a talent shortage. And I think what, is a great example of, what you're sharing is the thinking went from, how do we overcome the talent shortage to almost like, we're in a different environment. How do we leverage the, talent? How do we access the best people? How do we provide an environment that best people want to work in? How can we help people do their best work? Like, these are questions that, very seldom do I see founders asking. It's almost like, I kind of go back to, the 1920s, 1930s, when you'd see these pictures of, kind of queues of people wanting a job, and they'd all have a resume in their hand, and the queues like about 5 miles long. This was the Great Depression, right? Where people were literally starving and there was no work and they were desperate for jobs. And these recruitment process and methodology that most businesses are still using today was developed then to handle that mass kind of recruitment, right? And it's, nobody's out there begging for a job anymore. Nobody's
Definitely not. And I think that one of the points you made there, which is so spot on, is that round you're looking for that blue-eyed unicorn, which is ultimately 3 different roles. And it's in one of the books that's there behind me. But this notion that, particularly in a high growth startup and scale up environment, the business is different every 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
And knowing that and thinking about that, for example, if you're a 3-person startup and you're hiring your first, head of engineering, there are some that will stay that course, that whole journey for 10 years and see to the exit. But there's a lot where you need a different person with a different set of, both skills and life experiences as the business grows. And that's something I think to be embraced, not something to be sort of shy away from. And to your point, needing to be honest with yourself that, you might want to solve these 1 or 5 or 7 things. The reality is that maybe one person just can't solve all of those, and you actually need to solve these 3 things first, and then you're going to have a different set of 3 challenges that a different person needs to solve, and so on as you move through the business.
Yeah, that's spot on, Josh. I would, often advise, particularly earlier stage startups that, look, just look at the next 6 months, earn the right for the next 6 months, right? Find the person that's going to help you get there. And then the whole world changes, right? The environment's going to look very different. Your plans are going to change. The strategy is going to change. The opportunities are going to change. The type of people that you're going to need to help you get there, that will change as well. And I think this is kind of, again, it's where we're, and this isn't, a kind of criticism. It's just facts, right? Is that less than 1% of founders have any real experience in HR and talent and people and recruitment, right? They might have been involved. They might have, hired people, but they've never ran the process. And they've certainly never kind of done it from the perspective of actually, how do people contribute to meeting business goals? You can do it within a team or a division, but within an organization, it's very, very different. And getting that dynamics right, and how long's a person going to be there? And unfortunately, I think most founders, their experience has been gained in a corporate, where it's been working for people who stuck in an office, who you look at them being there in the role for 3 to 5 years, and that's successful, and you get a return on investment. Whereas in your business, right, somebody could come in for 3 months, kick a massive goal, and they get out of Dodge. Now, somebody look at their resume and go, oh, you were only there for 3 months. You're a bit of a job hopper. It's like, no, I went there, I delivered what they needed me to deliver. Right? There was nothing else for me to do. And it's these kind of perceptions, right, that are all based on, what is businesses from 100 years back.
Yeah.
And yet we're trying to apply it into this digital world.
Yeah, I agree. And you mentioned the 6-month thing. That's something that when I'm particularly going through a fundraising process, I find probably the most agitating is as we start, like explain what the next 12 to 24, 5 years are going to look like. And it's like, you have no clue.
Yeah, exactly.
You really have no clue. That's the honest answer, is that no one knows.
Yeah.
Like if you'd asked me that question in January of 2020, would I have told you that in end of March 2020, I wouldn't be able to leave my house except for 1 hour of exercise a day? Like, absolutely not. And I wouldn't have then told you that, we were scenarioing a complete drop of revenue to 0% and then 100% increase at the same time simultaneously. How do you plan for that sort of stuff? So I think being laser focused on that 6 month, or even if in an earlier stage, even quarterly, that is so much more appropriate to tackling the problems you have in front of you. And then sort of adjusting accordingly. And you're so right. Even I'm victim to this, is particularly when you have, first-time founders, you learn from what you can and from the people you have around you. But the number one way you learn is through mistakes, and it's like, and I've made so many countless ones of them as we've gone through, and you wish you hadn't, but it's the only way to really learn. And it's the only way to actually understand, like, hey, this is how you have to approach that differently next time. This is the impact of the wrong hire. This is, when is the right time for someone to step aside and someone else to move up and reapproach a different way to talent and all of those sort of things. It's trial and error is the best way, but you need to be able to just sort of swallow the pill when it doesn't work and move on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that point you made about what does the next 12 months look like? I think the most honest answer I've ever heard to that question was a client who said, look, I've got a 10-year vision and a 90-day plan. If you're looking for anything more, I can't give it to you.
So true.
Yeah.
That's so true.
Now, I wanted to talk a little bit more about, I guess, we've talked about how you're hiring people. Yeah, it's another thing retaining them. And we've kind of touched on this a bit, which is, the business is moving that fast. Not everybody's going to be with you for the whole journey. Gosh, I mean, you mightn't even be there for the whole journey as well. How do you, kind of keep your morale? How does the culture develop? How do you keep everything positive? When, look, it's inevitable that there are going to be people who might still love working at Indebted, but the business has outgrown them. Or, they've joined when you were earlier stages and, they love being a generalist, and now you need to push them into more of a specialist role, and they're not getting the challenge, or the thrill that they would through that. How do you approach those situations? Because they're really difficult. I mean, that's, you've been through some phases of growth, which are the most difficult ones, which is that kind of 50 to 75, 75 to 150, 150 to 300, because that's when I think the business changes the most. You kind of, where you're getting to now is enterprise, so it kind of steadies a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the first way is back to the earlier point, like, you're going to make mistakes. You got to own up to them, be humble about it, and communicate sort of, with honesty and with integrity on how you approach it. I think there's a couple of components to it. So in terms of obviously making sure that, from as much as you can on the retention side and investing in that, and I'll come to that part. But I think other part is just being upfront and honest. There are many, many people who work at Indebted today who will not work here in 6 months or 12 months or 24 months, 36 months. That's a good thing. People shouldn't stay at one place forever. It's important to get new experiences, and certainly as a founder, and then I encourage this to our executive team and then also our hiring managers, is that is part of it, and you want people to leave as gracefully as you bring people into the business, and you want to champion them from the sidelines. And I've seen people who've come through our business and now going on to do other great things. And that, if anything, that makes me more proud than just seeing the byproduct of the company itself, right? You have to be able to live with that. And I also tell my team exactly what you mentioned. Like, I may not be here at some point in time. If there comes time that there is a better CEO to take over, that is what's in the best interest of the business, I will do that. Very early on, one of my really close sort of angel investors really helped me understand this notion of decoupling myself from the business, almost treating it like it's a child, right? You want it to grow up and become independent and go off on its own. It can't be attached to you at all times. And that's something that I've, always sort of embraced, and I encourage everyone else in the team and across our business to do so. But when it comes back to for those that do want to work here and want to be successful and growing that, I always sort of follow, it's a pretty simple mantra, but I want to make Indebted a place that I would want to work. You bring up the background and different jobs and stuff. I had a corporate role, and actually I loved my time in that job and I learned a lot. But yeah, I'd be lying to say there weren't times where I thought like I could do it better, right? That's obviously why I'm in this position that I am today and decided to start my own company. But I always look at it through the eyes of the team and think like, I want this to be a place where I would apply for a role, as an engineer or as an account executive. And I want to, encourage it to be a place that where people would want to work. And if I can make it a place that I would want to work, I think that would translate across to the rest of the team. And then I think that manifests itself in the initiatives that we do. So, we get a lot of focus on the 4-day work week, the flexible leave, the remote working stipend, and a bunch of other things. But I think they are more the byproducts of ingesting the data, interrogating it, putting out things, rinse and repeat, understanding what's working, what's not working, and moving forward. And using our sort of pulse surveys is the best way that we do that. So asking people around, how proud are they to work at Indebted, and do they recommend it as a great place to work, and do they see themselves working here in 2 years' time? Having that barometer of data based on the things that we're doing and how the business is operating gives us a good indication. Like, we're going in the right direction, let's follow that path, or this isn't working, and that's okay. Let's understand from that, pivot course and try and correct some of those things. And that's sort of why we have the things we have today, rather than putting something like the 4-day work week in and hoping it's just going to fix everything. That wasn't where we came from.
I've been watching recently Super Pumped, the show about Uber, and it's kind of really apparent that TK created an environment that, to your point, he wanted to work in. But what I'm hearing from you is that you've got to then listen to the feedback.
Yeah, you have to, and I think you also have to respect just how crazy this sort of environment is. It's and I keep going back to the last couple of years because it has just been a whirlwind. When you even mentioned last time we were there, it was 80 people. I don't even know how nearly another 200 people have joined the business since then. It's just been an absolutely crazy journey, but it's like that inside the vast majority of every single startup you talk to. And it's hard for people who haven't been in that environment or around that environment to respect just what sort of toll that takes on people. And you need to be able to, be receptive of that feedback. I was looking at this business a couple of weeks back, and one of the bits of feedback that one of the executive team members mentioned to me when I asked around culture and what's your assessment on, the culture that you have, and like, we don't run any surveys. And I said, oh, well, why is that? And they said, well, we get a lot of people who complain and whatever else. And I was like, so, well, the answer is you don't like the data that's coming back from the survey, so you don't want to ask the survey to deal with the reality. I think there's no way to get better from that, right? If the data's bad, and we make mistakes all the time. Data's bad, you have to learn from it, adjust it, explain why, and move forward. I don't think anybody's perfect, and anyone coming into an organization expecting it to look like it does on the pitch deck is in for a rude awakening, because there's what you see from the outside and the amount of grunt work that happens inside to make that look that way. But I just think you have to be able to learn from the data, adjust, take the punches when they come, and run with the successes when they're there, and follow behind them.
Great. Now, before we wrap up, Josh, I do have one last thing that it's actually the most burning thing that I've wanted to ask you. And it's kind of the reason why I want to ask you is you actually responded to a tweet on this that I put out a couple of weeks back, and it's the chief of staff. It's the bane of my life. All right. And why I'm against, and it's not the people, it's against the, what I've got a big problem with is that it's a role that isn't defined, right? Most instances where I see it literally the mandate is to do the shit that I don't want to do and that I don't want to deal with. So just like you said with that survey, and the feedback's coming back, and nobody wants to deal with it. And it seems like the chief of staff is given that mandate to deal with that, but then doesn't have the kind of ultimate authority to then action on it, which, to me, you're setting up somebody to fail, right? And actually the data that I've got, and this is over the last 3-4 years, is that 90% of chiefs of staff have been in the job for 6 months and they leave.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, I was kind of really interested because, yourself and another founder who, is again, one of the best founders I've ever met, and I think has a very similar kind of outlook to you, also challenged me on that tweet. And so I'd love to get kind of your interpretation of chief of staff and how it's helped you, one, become the best place to work in Australia, but two, help you do it in a period where you've tripled the size of the workforce as well.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of good things. So I think firstly, let's preface it with, I think you are actually right 85, 90% of the time, because I think it is just that, we'll call it, there's a sexiness to the chief of staff role. Yeah. Every founder wants one. Is it like...
It does seem like it's a vanity hire, right? And it's like, oh, they've got it in Silicon Valley. Let's us get a chief of staff.
Absolutely. It's like a major sort of bank or something having like a chief innovation officer or something. What is it, right? How is it different from what your CTO or CIO is already doing, having this person in this sort of different role? And I respect that. And I think there's also a lot of confusion on, is a chief of staff an executive assistant? Are they, what exactly is that role? The thing that I looked at when we went down that route was actually how sort of the chief of staff worked at Amazon under Jeff Bezos, and ultimately that person ended up running a large chunk of Amazon. I think it was AWS, if memory serves me correctly, or another part of the business. And ultimately, sort of that was the plan. So the idea, and again, I'm no expert, but just speaking from experience here on my side, is it's a role that encompasses a period of time, let's say it's 1 to 2 years, where it's about building that person in a very fast-paced way. Like, how do you go through a whole bunch of learnings and experiences by being right at the sort of coalface of everything that's happening, that allows that person then to take over a critical leadership role within the business, and be or a whole different business unit, or a whole different part of the company, or a new product. And so that's how I approached it. And I think when I also would caveat that I think the role is very different for different startups. I think in a lot of startups, the chief of staff role almost plays this like proxy investment banker analyst type of role, where they're helping with cap raising, they're doing the modeling, they're helping on sort of that sort of side of things. In our business, we have other people who can help with that. For me, it was about working on projects that I thought were important outside of what was already happening that the team is executing on, and how I can almost be a further extension of myself to go and execute. One of the challenges I faced personally growing the business is, the bigger the business gets, the harder and harder I find it is to impact little bits of change. Obviously, I can communicate things and rally people and do things like that, which I think is great. But it's hard for me to go and I don't have access to some of the systems I used to have access to. And for me, like as a founder that actually come from an engineering background, I built the first version of the product myself in the lounge room. That's really hard to detach from. And even if I could be involved, it's also much more complicated than it was before. It's a lot harder to get into the nitty gritty and enact some of that change. But there are a bunch of projects when I look across the business at a sort of 1,000-foot view that I go, we could really optimize that area of the company, or we could, look to spin this out into a different product offering, or we could go test this idea in another market, or we should go and do A, B, C, D, and E, do an acquisition, do something else. And that was really what the chief of staff role was for me. It was somebody who could, for essentially, be that number two along your side there, working and go, okay, I get that idea. I understand that initiative. Let me challenge you on that. And then let me help you go and execute on that, whilst also, doing what we need to do to run the business. For me, that was a role that was filled from an internal role, so someone we already had. We're a very different business than a lot of sort of pure SaaS companies. So, there's an operational intensity to our business. And so, the person who it was in our chief of staff role, Ellie, had that immense amount of background and also industry experience, which was invaluable to me in terms of some of the initiatives I wanted to run and how we wanted to do things. But to your point, and some of my earlier comments, Ellie recently just moved into our COO role. So she took over as Chief Operating Officer now after about a bit over a year and a half of being in that Chief of Staff position. So I think that is ultimately what you want to do. You want to be able to craft that into someone who can have that breadth of experience and then take over a large chunk of the organization. But look, I certainly agree with you on 85% of the time. It's a bit of a vanity role. I love to hire for.
I think one of the other kind of mistakes that I see happen a lot as well is that early stage startups, they'll meet with somebody who they think is fantastic. There's kind of a mutual love affair there, but it's actually not the right time to join the business. And so they create this chief of staff position for them. And again, I think the difficulty with that is somebody externally coming into it, who's then basically the chief exec's kind of, right-hand person. It's very difficult for somebody new to then be able to influence. You got to spend 6 months building trust with people. And they're going to test you, and they're going to think, hey, well, this person really got what it takes. So I absolutely agree with you. I think, the choosing the internal option and having that intent as to, hey, this is a person that we want to develop, we want to nurture, we want to give them broader experience, but we know that we're going to set them up for success in this position. I think that's when it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to, it has to be introspective in terms of like, what are your skill sets and where can you add value the most as the CEO or the founder or whatever role it is that you hold in the business, and how can that person not only just be an extension of that, but be complementary to that. And I think that is exactly the relationship that I had, with Ellie, which is our chief of staff, and continue to now as a COO. But it's about finding that right balance. And me, particularly as the sort of eccentric founder you see, is like, I want to go in, I want to enact change, I want to do something, but it's hard to do that and enact that across an organization of 270 people, or even if it's within a sub part of the business of like 60 or 70. There's operational rigor, and there's ways that things that need to be done, and that's where my relationship worked really well with Ellie in that case. But I think it'd be different for other founders. I mean, some founders that aren't great at fundraising, or they aren't great at selling, and so that chief of staff role maybe becomes that sort of complement on that side. But I agree with you. It's not one of those things that you should sort of sit down and go, first hire, third hire, I need a chief of staff, and this is why. I think it's something that only really sort of started to hit the radar for me as a role to consider 4.5 years into the journey.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Josh, it has been absolutely incredible to talk with you about the journey and the things that you've done to, be quite rightly accoladed with the best place to work in Australia. I can't quite believe that I'm saying those words to you. It sounds pretty amazing, right? Folks, we are talking about the best place to work in Australia, not the best tech company, not the best the best company to work with in Australia. What an accolade that is.
I appreciate it, man. And yeah, likewise, it's equally crazy to hear it as well. But immensely proud of it, and it's really, again, it's a reflection of our team, and it's not a solo effort by any means at all.
Well, Josh, some seriously talented people listen to this show. If they're interested in working at the best place to work in Australia, how can they get in touch, or where do they need to go?
Yeah, so definitely jump on our careers page, and all the roles are up there. Or otherwise, feel free to reach out and connect on LinkedIn. I think some of the best introductions and best hires we've ever made have come from sort of cold outreach, building a relationship over a 3, 6, 9 month period. And then, like you said, when the organization's ready and certain roles you have that sort of connection with people that that are great to work with on that part.
Fantastic, Josh. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Dexter. It was great. Thanks for having me.
And you can connect with me on LinkedIn and Twitter as Dexter Cousins. Please help support businesses like Indebted and get the word out there on great founders by giving us a subscribe and a like. In 2022, I'm committed to showcasing Australia's very best fintechs on the channel, so help us to spread the good word and show your support. Until the next episode, keep safe. Fintech Chatter is presented by Tier 1 People, leaders in fintech executive search. We'll help you launch, scale, and innovate by delivering world-class talent. And you can find out more at tier1people.com.